Hello folks, how you doing? Scotty. So I was recently sent this video by a friend
Hey guys, it's Mexie.
on Mexie, and Mexie talks about the free market. Now, first of all, here's what she has to say.
Why people who need redistribution the most hate it the most, or hate the idea of it the most.
The problem with that argument, Mexie, is the very fact that we do not oppose the redistribution of wealth. We support redistribution of wealth, but we support it more in a voluntary action. Now, there's a strong difference between socialism and capitalism in that regard. Capitalism is all about charity. Socialism is all about government coercion.
It's also going to be a bit about, the free market and this ideology and why it is completely backwards and not ever going to help the majority of people.
Well, you see, the problem with that argument, Mexie, is the very fact that the free market has helped the masses. In fact, we've seen that from recorded history. No one would ever say that we've ever had a 100% truly free market. And economics doesn't work like that. There's a scale. It's a question of scale. And when you look at the scale between socialism and capitalism, we can see the most capitalist-based systems have been better off. They've proven to help the masses. We've seen this in recorded history when Hong Kong between 1961 to 1997, proven by the Gini coefficient, had closed the wealth gap between the rich and poor. We saw this historical evidence, and this was Hong Kong, of course, that had practically no natural resources, no minimum wage, and yet an average household income they have today of more than 55,000 plus.
But just, plainly, like the basic idea is that if the market were to be completely free, then it would regulate itself for the best possible outcome for all people and the planet.
You see, you make a claim that the free market cannot regulate itself, but what contradicts you is recorded history. What contradicts you is the very fact that prior to the 1960s, between 1870 and 1960, Sweden became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP, and yes, they did have extremely low levels of government regulation. This was a country where its market was strongly self-regulating. This is no different to what happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was an economy strongly self-regulating, and the economy proved and fared better off. It is no different to Singapore, it was no different to Chile, and yet there was Michelle Bachelet, a socialist, who could not deny the success of the free market.
And people say that leftists are utopian, and yet this is honestly the belief.
It's not a case that we're utopian. It's a case that we actually understand something called economics. The goal of any private business owner, the goal of any private landowner is to make a profit. How do you think a private landowner or a private business owner maximizes their profits? How do they do that? They maximize their profits by minimizing their costs. You're going to maximize your profits by minimizing your costs. Therefore, show me the logic in using more resources when it costs you more to use more resources. Now, you sit there and laugh at that, which is incomprehensible. Why would you use more resources if you're maximizing your profits? It costs you more to use more resources. Didn't you know that? Now, the second issue, which contradicts you, is the fact that private landowners have the incentive to appreciate the value of their land. Your land can either depreciate in value or it can appreciate in value. Show me the incentive of any private landowner to depreciate the value of their land. There's no incentive at all, is there? Of course not. If a private landowner wishes to sell their land on at a profit, they're going to need to appreciate the value of their land. And the only way they're going to do that is look after their land.
The exploitation of the environment is just, digging up resources and doing a lot of other stuff to cut costs, like maybe dumping your shit in the ocean or...
It's this myth again about the externalities. The idea that they would just dump things in the ocean and somehow they would just get away with it. I'm sorry, things don't work like that, because the idea is the fact that you do have the government there to protect individuals' property rights. And if that is going to cause damage to another business, that business then does have the right to take action against that business. And they have the right to do so because it could potentially harm that business.
But at like its most fundamental level, capitalism began, it grew out of feudalism.
No. You cannot take a collectivist system. Another word for socialism is collectivism. You cannot take a collectivist system whereby the state is the central power and authority over the economy, where the state dictates production, where the state dictates how much gets produced, what gets produced, which was feudalism. Similar to communism, you cannot take a collectivist socialist system known as feudalism and try to say that capitalism bred out of that. That is completely irrational, because capitalism falls under individualism. Now, individualism is the opposite of collectivism. You cannot take collectivist systems such as imperialism, colonialism, fascism, or even feudalism or theocracy and attempt to blame that on capitalism.
It began really through the enclosure of commons, so the enclosure of common space, and then kicking all the peasants and everything off of that common space.
Are you being serious? Let me read this out to you, because this is a piece of history that will teach you why the enclosure movement has happened. When the first American settlers came to America in the 17th century, the word capitalism had not yet been coined, but the most important ingredient of capitalism, private property, was responsible for their very survival, and indeed the creation of America, as Tom Bethel explains in The Noblest Triumph, Property and Prosperity Through the Ages. The American settlers originally adopted communal ownership of land and property, and as a result, most of them starved to death or died of disease, a problem endured in later centuries by virtually every communist country that adopted collectivized agriculture. Now, we could see that from the very centralisation of agriculture in the Soviet Union, and of course the Great Leap Forward in 1960, where more than 30 million people died of starvation. It just goes to show you that people obviously never learn from history, and here's a prime example of what I'm talking about. He goes on to say the first American settlers arrived in Jamestown in May of 1607. There in the Virginia Tidewater region, they found incredibly fertile soil and a cornucopia of seafood, wild game such as deer and turkey, and fruits of all kind. Nevertheless, within 6 months, all but 38 of the original 104 Jamestown settlers were dead, most having succumbed to famine. 2 years later, the Virginia Company sent 500 more recruits to settle in Virginia, and within 6 months, a staggering 440 were dead by starvation and disease. And I can continue on by pointing this out. In 1611, the British government sent Sir Thomas Dale to serve as the High Marshal of the Virginia colony. Dale noted that although most of the settlers had starved to death, the remaining ones were spending much of their time playing games in the streets, and he immediately identified the problem: the system of communal ownership. He determined therefore that each man in the colony would be given 3 acres of land and be required to work no more than 1 month per year, and not at planting or harvest time, to contribute to the treasury of the colony. The farmers would be required to pay the colony a lump sum tax of 2.5 barrels of corn. Private property was thus put into place, and the colony immediately began to prosper. For you to complain about the communal ownership of farming being abolished, well, it was abolished for the simple reason being that prior to the Industrial Revolution, you saw the periodical famines. Isn't it simply magical that as soon as the communal ownership of farming came to an end in Great Britain, we never saw a famine ever since?
And I think that's something that a lot of people forget, or they somehow think that like capitalism is a system that can lead us to equality somehow, or social justice. Like
No, Mexie, capitalism is not about that. The true meaning of equality was everybody started off at the same position. It's called equal opportunity. Equality did not mean everybody ended in the same position. That is what you call ignorance. Why the hell should someone who works harder end in the same position as someone who works less?
if you look at the history of capitalism, the history of neoliberalism, like inequality grows, and things like neoliberal policies only allow that exploitation to just get more and more like cruel and brutal and just like bare.
Well, here's a fine example for you. Ronald Reagan, someone you love to hate. Between 1975, although Ronald Reagan was, president into the 1980s, between 1975 and 1991, the poor moved up the ladder in wages by $27,000 plus. Whereas in that same time period between 1975 and 1991, the rich only increased in wages by $4,000 plus. In other words, the rich grew richer, but the poor grew richer faster.
And that's what the free market is. So the more you remove protections for the people who are on the bottom and struggling, the worse off everyone is. Like, I don't understand how people think that like somehow through competition, the best thing is going to happen for everyone. Like, competition, just like the idea of competition itself is like two people compete, there is a winner and there is a loser.
The problem is, Mexie, not everyone can be a winner. And that's part of the problem you have today. In the absence of free market capitalism, you have a system where you are rewarding failure and punishing success. That, in its very definition, is anti-capitalist. Capitalism is all about rewarding success and punishing failure. If you're not going to punish failure, how are they ever supposed to learn their lesson? Are you going to continue on the bailouts, make the taxpayers poorer, to bail failure out, just so that when you waste the taxpayers' money, failure continues on failing? Because that's essentially all you're doing. You're rewarding, basically failure. And a great example of that was none other than the banking crisis. It was called legally protected fraud. That's what caused it. So whenever you have a dog, and a dog is being bad, do you give the dog doggy treats for being bad? No. You punish its poor behaviour. That's what you do. You punish its poor behaviour. How else is it supposed to learn its lesson? And you see, that's what you don't seem to understand. The free market deals in the best way possible. Not everyone can be, successful. That's just the case. But at least those who are unsuccessful can learn from those who are more competent, and therefore they can improve. It's not the end of things. They can always start up business again, but they can start up business in an improved environment where they may have learned something. You see, that's the difference. You don't seem to understand that. It's the same thing when it comes to a sports team. How the hell do you think the youth learns? The youth learns from people who are better than themselves, more experienced than themselves. That's how they improve, by playing against better quality. Well, it's no different in the marketplace with competition. If you take away competition, what exactly are you wanting? Are you wanting a monopolistic system? Because that's essentially what led to the very corporatist system we see today. The lack of competition, big giant monopolies. Or do you want to nationalise everything away? We could go into that subject, because at the end of the day, what are you going to use in order to fund the public sector then? Because it's the government that pays the wages of those who work in the public sector, and where does government get the money from to pay the public sector wages? It gets it from the private sector. So if you've got no private sector, where are you going to get the money from to pay the wages of the public sector? You're going to have no money at all? Is that how you're going to run things? And all trade, by the way, is capitalism. So what are you going to do? You're going to ditch trade so that there's no such thing as money coming into the country? So what then are you going to do? Because that's essentially what India did. India shut off trade to the outside world, and by Christ, did it pay the price for it.
For example, removing regulations around labor, like busting up unions, not regulating overtime hours, taking away benefits, taking away, security. You can see very clearly how these are not things that are going to bring the most benefit to the most people.
It's funny you should say that, Mexie, because the United States of America is actually the fine example of capitalism having improved the marketplace, improved the safety conditions within the marketplace. It was competition and business reputation that did that. But when the government began to intervene in that sector during the 1970s, what happened? The death toll began to stagnate. Prior to that, capitalism was reducing the death rate, the death toll, year in, year out, and it was capitalism that was reducing the working hours. In other words, it was capitalism that was continuously improving the workplace. It was capitalism that was continuously reducing the death toll. Isn't it a surprise that as soon as the government stepped in with its regulation in the 1970s, isn't it simply wonderful that the death toll began to stagnate? Why? I would love to see your response to that one.
This just allows companies who are in competition with one another to put that downward pressure on labor, so that they can increase their profits. And, a lot of people talk about how in our parents' day, work was so much more secure and people had so many more benefits and it was so easy to get a job and blah, blah, blah. And that's because a lot of these regulations were in place and they've been slowly but surely dismantled, particularly since the 1980s when this whole neoliberal free market ideology really took hold.
No offence, Mexie, but that is absolute nonsense. The United States of America, no different to Great Britain, has seen nothing other than financial regulations vastly increase, not decrease. To say that the financial regulations is the reason for why, there was more work during that time period is absolute drivel. It really is drivel, to say the least. The reason why you have fewer jobs is because of the strong government regulation. The strong government regulation is weighing down the smaller businesses, where the smaller businesses cannot afford the costs of the heavy government regulation. It cannot afford the costs, and therefore it's causing a monopolistic system because the big corporations can afford. The big corporations are paying the government, they're lobbying the government for more government regulations to stamp out the competition of smaller businesses. And whilst the big corporations can pay people to find loopholes in the government regulations, the smaller businesses cannot afford to.
Another example is healthcare. The free market means cutting expenditures to healthcare, cutting expenditures to everything. So Americans pay the most for healthcare in the entire world. People have to mortgage their houses and live on the freaking street because they get a broken bone or something. It's absolutely insane, the cost that Americans pay.
No, you didn't just go there, did you? A free market in healthcare means that there is a straight transaction between the consumer and the provider, and the consumer gets to shop around for what they want. Now, I have never been in the United States of America in my entire life. I've never been there, I've never lived there, never stepped foot in the United States of America, and doesn't it feel rather quite sad that I know more about American healthcare than you do? I can sit here for someone who's never been in the United States of America, and I can sit and tell you that No, you do not have a straight transaction between the consumer and the provider. What you have is a third-party payer system where the government is the third party determining the cost. In other words, when someone else is determining the cost, you're going to end up with that. And what did the government do through the third-party payer system? It created a collusion with the private pharmaceutical companies, forcing costs basically through the roof. Now that's what you have. You have an anti-free market healthcare system that is so anti-capitalist, it's unreal.
This is the free market at work. Like, how do people not understand that, like, this is not helpful for the majority of people? And, you know, in this, like, deregulated banking system, like, we have, and in this, you know, deregulated financial system, we have, you know, the richest people just making more and more and more and more money.
You do realise that Sweden was a country that began deregulation and privatisation in 1993. And you do realise that Denmark is a country with low levels of government regulation and stormed past 2008 without a problem. And you also realise, no in fact you do not realise, why? Because after what you just stated there is complete drivel. Why? Because financial regulations in the United States has been vastly increasing, not decreasing. In fact, what you don't understand is the fact that financial regulations had nothing at all to do with why the banking crisis happened. In other words, it wouldn't even matter if you argued about deregulation or whatnot. That's not the reason why the banking crisis happened. The banking crisis happened because of the vast increase of issuing out cheap credit and the very issue in the laws of supply and demand. If you've got a shortage of something and you issue out cheap credit, you've got a massive, increase in demand. The costs are going to soar through the roof, causing a housing bubble and burst. But most importantly, because of bad banks becoming too big to fail, called legally protected fraud, where the government was always there to protect the bad banks from failing, constantly bailing them out. Now what contradicts you is the very fact that Iceland done the exact opposite. Iceland let the bad banks fail. Iceland practiced capitalism. Iceland deregulated. Iceland did exactly the opposite of what you're basically saying. And did Iceland suffer? Did Denmark suffer? Did the likes of Sweden suffer? No, they did not.